Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Burslem Elim Church Leadership course and Bible study. I encourage you, if you are not part of the group and doing this at home later, to look at the feedback sheet we have, just some stuff to do afterwards, some questions to ask, which will be really helpful in continuing on to the course. So we start off, what is leadership? And to me, leadership is influence. You know, it's that simple. The people you influence are the people who you potentially lead. That could be in your family. You could lead in your family, in your workplace, in your friendship groups, at church, Bible studies, in the community, in the sports team. And the person who holds the most influence is often the leader. Now, someone could officially be given the title of leader, but if they don't hold the influence, then people often gravitate towards a person who's more influential. If you think about football, if you're into sport like myself, often the team captains hold a lot of influence in the sports clubs. And then quite often you see when a new manager comes in, they'll ship out some players who have got a lot of influence, often players who are captains or vice captains, because sometimes they can hold more influence than the manager holds. So influence is what leadership comes down to. And it's sort of the main thing. The person with the most influence will direct the organization or the group or the family group in the direction they want to go. So it doesn't matter about title. Leadership is all about influence and who holds the most influence. So we're just going to go through just looking at some leaders in the Bible today. And so first of all, I'm sure, hopefully you guys will have a chance to read this either before or after today's session. But Hebrews chapter 11 talks about the heroes of faith, and it lists several different heroes. And often these guys who are mentioned in Hebrews 11 were actually leaders in Israel, and they led for God's people. And the first point of view which strikes me out of reading this passage is this, is that we are called to lead out of faith and relationships with God. So we're called to lead out of a faith of our relationship with God. And it's really interesting here that not all of these guys were leaders in Hebrews 11, but most of them were. And you know, as faith leaders, it's really important that we lead out of our relationship with God. You see, we cannot take anybody to a place that we haven't necessarily been ourselves, or we're not prepared to go with them there. And I'm really impacted by these guys and the way they led out of their faith. You've got Noah. Noah led his family through his relationship with God into the ark, and he was a messenger from God. And the only reason he led them onto the ark was because of his relationship with God. Then if you read down a few more of these characters, you have Abraham. Now Abraham led his family and his workers out of his relationship with God. Then you have Joseph. Joseph, a lot of bad stuff happened to him first, but when he eventually became Prime Minister of Egypt, he led out of the dreams that God had given Pharaoh and his ability to interpret. So again, he led out of his relationship with God. And Moses, he led the people out of captivity, out of his relationship with God. So you can see by Hebrews 11 that one of the most important bit of being a Christian leader is to lead out of your faith and your relationship with God. And just to clarify, all the stories that I mentioned today are going to be in the follow-up sheet that I will give you afterwards. The next thing we need to do is this. If we lead completely in our own strengths and abilities, we will be limited by our weaknesses. If we lead through God's strengths and abilities, we are limited by His weaknesses. I'll read that again. If we lead completely in our own strength and abilities, we will be limited by our weaknesses. If we lead through God's strengths and abilities, we are limited by His weaknesses. Now, this is a really important principle that we can learn from the characters in Hebrews 11 and other biblical leaders in the Old Testament. We think about Moses, for example. Now, if Moses had led in his own strength, what would have happened when he got to the Red Sea? Now, the Red Sea wouldn't have parted. The people of Israel wouldn't have been able to go through the Red Sea and escape from the Egyptians. Now, Moses led out of his relationship with God, as I mentioned in point 1, but he wasn't limited by his own strengths and abilities. He was only limited by God. And when you're limited by God, there is so much more opportunities and you can achieve so much more than you ever could imagine. And this is really important because as Christian leaders, we can't just look at ourselves, even though that is wise, and look at our own capabilities. We need to also look at the capabilities of God within us. So when someone says, I think you could be good at doing this, and you might look at yourself and say, you know what, I can't do it in my own strength, but you might be able to do it with God's strength. Now, at a later series, we'll look at using your strengths and abilities, so it's being sensible about it. So if you can't sing, maybe God is not calling you to be a worship leader. So you have to be sensible. But being a faith leader is relying on God's weaknesses and strengths, which there are no weaknesses in God, not our own. The next thing you learn from biblical leaders is this: God will equip us with the tools that we need to lead in the places He has called us. A few years ago, when I was a young Christian, I heard someone called Tommy Barnett speak. He did an amazing church in America, grew spectacularly. And he said these words, which I've never ever been able to forget. He said this: God has given you everything you need to build a house. Now, he was talking about being a pastor and building a church, but his comments have always remained with me. You know what God has called me to do, He will help me through and He will provide. You know, as a pastor, I never go to God, if you could only give me a few more of these people, it would help me. I often say to God, I believe you've given me the tools. Now, please, can you help me to put them into place? Now, this is really, really tough when we look at it, because sometimes we can look at what we haven't got rather than what we have got. But God has given you everything that you need to do what you need to do. Even today, recording this, the screen that's behind me with my points on, this was in my garage, an old screen, which was there for me to use. God had given me everything that I need to pull this together. And the character who I love in the Old Testament is Nehemiah. He's one of my favorite characters. And Nehemiah was a man who helped start to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem after the people of Israel had been in captivity. Now, he was in a place where he could achieve more than he ever realized. And he was really sad and depressed because the walls were crumbling around Jerusalem. But his job was cupbearer to the king of Persia. And one day when he's with the king of Persia sees Nehemiah a bit sad and says, Nehemiah, what is the problem? And Nehemiah explains about being sad about the walls. And the king of Persia says, you know what, Nehemiah, pull together some guys, go back to Israel or Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. And he said, you know what, even more than that, he said, I will help give you some of the wood and I will help provide the stuff that you need to rebuild those walls. You see, Nehemiah had a desire, he had a burden on his heart to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, by himself, it was impossible, but God put him in the right place with the right person with him to provide the right tools that he needed to achieve his mission. And you know what God calls us to do, He will equip us. And that's a faith leader. We don't just look at what's in our hands, we also look at what God can provide. The next thing of this, being a Christian leader and leading out of faith and relationship with God doesn't mean it will always be easy. Now, I really wish someone had told me this as a start. When I was a young leader, I started off at about 21, I became a pastor. And before then I was serving a bit in church and I was leading youth groups and other things. But I wish someone had told me it wasn't easy. You know, I had imagined that if I followed God and did what God wanted, it would be a walk in the park, everything would be perfect. But being a Christian leader is really, really tough. Okay, often you have to go through really hard periods to get to where you want to be. And it's not always easy. You soon discover that you liked Christians and now you don't like Christians quite as much. And you realize that Christians and other people are just the same. And it's really tough at times. It can be lonely, it can be depressing, it can be really, really hard. And I think about Moses. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt incredibly. He did amazing things with the people. He saw amazing miracles happen. He saw God provide in spectacular ways. You know what? He achieved the impossible. No one thought it was possible for the Israelites to leave Egypt. And Moses was achieving so much, but Moses found it hard. He had people moaning at him. even though he freed them from slavery. And it got to the point, if you read Numbers 11, especially Numbers 11 verse 15, Moses says this, he says, "If this is how you intend to treat me, just go ahead and kill me. Do me a favor and spare me this misery." Now that's quite dramatic words to use, I'm sure. I've never actually thought of one of the congregation to kill me because of something. But Moses struggled with people he was serving. He struggled at times with the people that he was helping. And being a leader doesn't mean it will be easy. And if we look through the Old Testament, a lot of those guys, they suffered ridicule, they suffered persecution, things went wrong, people complained. It was really, really tough. The next thing is this. Number 5, biblical leaders make mistakes. Now, when I look through the Old Testament, I see leaders who make mistakes. I see leaders who are not perfect. I see leaders who struggle. I see leaders who really make huge mess ups. And when I was a young pastor, someone once said this to me. They said, "Jim, you are only as good as your last decision." And I was thinking, my goodness, that crippled me for a while. I was scared that if I made a mistake, that people would not believe me to be from God, a minister from God. They would not believe me as being the one to follow. They would doubt my leadership. And the thing I've realized as I've matured as a Christian leader is this, that biblical leaders make mistakes. Christian leaders will make mistakes. Mistakes are okay. Ideally, you want to try and avoid them as much as you can, but if you make them, you learn again. But even if I look at the Old Testament, there were some really extreme mistakes. Hopefully none of you will ever commit these. But you have Abraham, a man of faith, who God is leading, who is leading his workers, his wife, their household, and he's promised a baby. And the baby doesn't come. And eventually, he goes and sleeps with his wife's servant to try and force the issue. Now, he was a great man of faith, and God forgave him, and God worked through stuff, but he had a lot of consequences for his actions. But he made mistakes, but God still used him. We have David, who God actually calls a man after his own heart, who was is the greatest Jewish king. He slept with another man's wife and then got the other man's wife killed because the other man had more honor than him. God still forgave him and moved on. Now, I don't want you to commit those crimes, so please don't think it's okay to do those, because it's not. But what I'm trying to show is being a leader is not about being perfect, but it's about following God. A biblical leader follows God. They will make mistakes. Mistakes are okay because they're mistakes. But it's what we learn from those mistakes that matters. But we mustn't be frightened not to do anything because we're scared of making mistakes. And the last point for today's session is this. Biblical leaders direct people towards God. Now, this I'd say is probably the main difference between Christian leaders and other leaders. Biblical leaders, they're called to direct people towards God. Now, this sounds really obvious, but it's really important to remember. In the Old Testament, the leader's job was to direct people to listen to God and follow God's ways. Now, if you're a leader within church, if you are leading Sunday school, you wanting to direct the children that you are leading towards God. If you are leading in an asylum seeker ministry, you want to show God to the people who you're showing love to. As a pastor, my job and role is to direct people towards God. Now, it sounds really obvious, but it's really important. But if you're a parent, your job as a parent is to lead your family towards God. Your job as a boss is to show God's love and be a mediator for God where you are, and to use your relationship with God to direct how you manage people. And in the Bible, it's interesting, in 1 Samuel, we read about Saul, who was the first king of Israel. Now, he started off really well. Things went really well for him. He followed God. He listened to God. But there came a point when Saul stopped following God's guidance and started making the job all about him. He started making it about what he wanted and not what God wanted. And part of that was motivated by jealousy. He was a very jealous leader. When people were shouting that, look how many people David's killed compared to Saul, Saul got angry. Saul also wanted the credit for himself and don't think he really wanted to give the credit to God. And he started focusing on what he wanted and not what God wanted. And being a Christian leader, this is really important, that we focus on what God wants, not what we want. And when we keep in close relationship with him, as we said in point 1, and we lead out of our faith, this is easier. But if we don't lead out of our faith and we lead out of our natural talents, then this is when we go down the slippery slope of Saul. Now, Saul ended up trying to kill people. He ended up doing a lot of other crazy stuff, like seeking advice from mediums and dead spirits, all sorts of things. But he started off so well, but he ended up so badly. And biblical leaders, they need to direct people towards God. That needs to be their ultimate aim for all of it. So I hope that's been quite great for you to look at some perspectives. I encourage you now just to have a look at the sheet to follow up. All the Bible passages I've mentioned earlier are in there for you to follow up on. And if you're part of a group, now you'll have some questions, or if you're by yourself, answer them by yourself. If you're part of the group, we're going to answer them together as we look at exploring this more and discussing this more. Fantastic. I look forward to seeing you at the next session.